Okay. So for everybody, I'm happy to take questions through the Q&A box, or if you want to raise your hand, I will try to be able to see that as well. The idea is that we're going to talk about randomization techniques now, and we're going to do a mix of the theoretical foundation of like how to randomize properly, but also some practical tips of what that actually means when we go into the field. Okay, so this is what I want to start off with. So what is correlation? What is causation, right? Like the big question. And imagine like this graph here, right? So this is, the red line is the letters in winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee, and the number of people killed by venomous spiders is in black, right? So if we take this at face value, what we see is that there's definitely a relationship between these two types of data, meaning that, oh, it looks like actually when there are more words in the Scripps National Spelling Bee, when there are more letters in the word, then there are not more people going to be killed by venomous spiders. And I think it's pretty clear and like an intuitive that this is something that what we call spurious correlation. Okay, so this is not actually something where one is causing the other, but it's something where we want to be careful about what we draw in terms of conclusions. Okay, so Julia talked about this in the first session, but maybe some of you haven't been able, so I just want to recap because this is incredibly important to actually talk about randomization. So we have a potential outcomes framework, and that potential outcomes framework, as Julia explained, helps us to think about how to estimate a causal effect of a treatment W on some outcome Y, okay? So that we do not fall into the trap of spurious correlation, but actually estimate causal effects. So the potential outcomes framework was originally proposed by Neyman, and it goes like way back. So this is like almost 100 years now, and it was formalized by Rubin in 1974 into the Rubin causal model. When we think about randomizing things and controlled randomized experiments, we actually go back even further than those like 100 years to 1884, okay? But important, and this is what Julio talked about as well, is like Fisher 1934, where we say, okay, what do we actually do with experiments and like experimental economics? We want to have a hypothesis that we formulate and that we then test on the basis of randomization inference, okay? What we want to do is actually estimate theta as the comparison of two potential outcomes of the same unit. So the same person at the same moment in time. So what we would need is for us to clone ourselves to go into, you know, like one direction once, and or like at the same time as we go into a different direction. So this is called the fundamental problem of causal inference, because it's basically impossible for the same unit to be in two different states of the world at the same time, okay? Now, what randomization allows us to do is to consistently estimate theta, because what we really care about is the treatment effect on the entire population, which is also called the ATE, so the average treatment effect. For randomization to be, to have a consistent estimate of theta due to randomization, we need to meet two assumptions that are crucial, okay? The first one is called overlap, which means every unit I that is in our sample can be potentially exposed to the treatment, okay? And we need independence. So that means that our potential outcome Y over here is going to be independent of treatment assignment, okay? So once again, everybody has to be potentially exposed to the treatment, and the potential outcomes have to be independent of treatment assignment or orthogonal to treatment assignment. Okay, so randomization in theory. To randomize well, okay, so that our assumptions are actually met, the two that we just spoke about, we have to decide on a randomization process. That means we first choose our unit of randomization, So Jared just spoke about clustered designs or individual designs in terms of power, and now we're also going to talk about this in terms of our randomization process. And those typically have two levels of decision making that we have to take into consideration. The first one is, what level of randomization can we actually choose? Okay, like what levels of randomization are available. The second one is, what level of randomization should we choose from a design perspective? We then randomize, but have to decide on whether we stratify or do not stratify, and we have to decide on how many covariates we're actually going to do so. We have obviously then to have to implement our randomization strategy, and then several other questions occur that we're going to talk about, as for example, what if my randomization is not balanced? How am I actually going to implement my randomization strategy that I have designed? Is it going to be computer-based? Is there going to be an observable lottery? Is that going to be private or public? So those are all concerns that matter in field experiments. And then we're going to talk a bit about threats to these different strategies. I'm just going to check the Q&A, but I think those are still old questions. Okay, great. All right. So what we're going to talk about is basically the different steps of this figure, of this picture here. So we're going to talk about 3 different assumptions here that we want to meet. Okay, so this is following chapter 8 of John's upcoming textbook. So the non-zero probability condition is what we have talked before in terms of overlap, to say everybody has to be able to receive the treatment with a non-zero probability. Individualism condition and unconfoundedness are conditions that have to do with the independence assumption, but we're going to talk about this in a second. We then look at 4 different types that exist in the literature on classic random assignment mechanisms. Okay, we're going to focus on complete randomized experiments and randomized blocks, as this is similar to, or like builds up on what Jared has been talking about. The nulli trials is something that aren't, like, they are not very used a lot in field experiments, and I'm going to explain in a second why. And matched pairs is something that is sometimes very difficult to do, so we're going to focus on the two main ones. Okay, and then once we have randomized, we have to ask us the question about, did we achieve balance? If not, do we re-randomize? Can we adjust the regression? And if yes, we have to talk about design conscious inference. Okay, so let's go to the first step. Choose a unit of randomization. So we can decide to randomize at the individual level, or we can decide to randomize at the group level. Okay, this is what clustered randomized field experiments are called. So once again, individualism and unconfoundedness just means that our randomization strategy has to ensure that we're not going to have any relationship between our treatment assignment mechanism and our potential outcomes. And it has to be clearly defined who we're going to randomize into treatment and into control groups. Okay, so that means there has to be a clear cut where we define what's going to be the control and the treatment group. So the goal of experiments is to uncover causal relationships between independent and dependent variables. Okay, so in our model, the role of the assignment mechanism into either treatment or control can be given by this, which can be given by this parameter z here, is going to be crucial. Okay, so we have to think very carefully about what assignment mechanism we actually apply and why we do that. The assignment mechanism z is actually the process that determines unit-specific treatment status and therefore it's going to determine which data are missing and which are observable. Okay. So Emmons and Rubin in 2015 defined 3 basic restrictions that have to be met so that we can classify an assignment mechanism to be a classical randomized assignment mechanism. Okay? So because this is so important, we have this formalized here on this slide. So again, non-zero probability condition, everybody has to be able to receive the treatment. Importantly, the researcher controls the functional form of assignment probabilities. Okay, so we can choose whether your probability of being in the treatment group is 50%, but that can also be something different depending on the power calculations that Jared talked about before. Individualism, treatment is orthogonal to the outcomes and assignments of other units, and unconfoundedness, assignment of each treatment unit is orthogonal to potential outcomes. Okay, so each person has one treatment status assignment, and this assignment is independent of everybody else's assignment. Okay. So what these 3 restrictions allow us to do as researchers is then to estimate the causal impact of the assignment mechanism on the outcome of interest. Okay. So without needing to add any additional exclusion restrictions. So we have 4 popular randomized experimental approaches that have arisen that satisfy all these 3 restrictions. Okay, and then the key difference between the 4 types is around the assignment vectors imposed. So it just means like how the assignment is done in practice. So what we will learn is that as we impose greater restrictions on the assignment mechanism, the greater is the precision of the estimated treatment effects. Okay. So let me talk a bit about this really briefly. So the Bernoulli trial means that we have a group of respondents. This is our sample. And for each respondent, we're going to flip a coin. If it's heads, it's going to be the treatment group. If it's tails, it's going to be the control group. The disadvantage of the Bernoulli trial method is that in theory, if you have a very small sample, it could be that everybody ends up in the treatment group and we don't have a control group, right? Because, I mean, it could be by chance that everybody, like every coin flip results in heads, and then we don't actually have a randomized controlled experiment because we're missing the control group. So then what we do is we improve by going to the complete randomized experiment, where we reduce this threat by actually randomizing over the entire sample. Randomized block experiments, and we're going to talk about this more, means that we're randomizing within a block defined by a covariate, and then matched pairs would mean that we randomize after matching people to each other given observables. Okay. All right. How you choose your randomization level depends on various considerations. Okay. It could be that your research partner, okay, actually has specific units that it targets for treatment. So this depends on the administration of a program or intervention. So it could be, for example, that you have an entrepreneurship program that is targeted to women in Uganda, and then your target unit is going to be the individual. But it could also be that you're implementing a program that is going to affect school inputs, and then your randomization unit should be the school because the entire school is going to receive the treatment. Another point of consideration is to think about what analysis level you will actually be able to look at, okay? So at what aggregation level do you actually have data? Do you have data on the individual? Then most likely you want to randomize on individual level. But if you only have aggregate data on the school level, then it's not going to be helpful for you to randomize on the individual level because you're going to have to look at the school level data in any case. Statistical power matters, and then ultimately something that is very important to take care of, but very difficult as well, is to take spillover and general equilibrium questions into consideration. Okay, so this means that if you have data at the individual level and you can implement at the individual level, but you're highly concerned about spillovers because people live in a village very, very close to each other, for example, then you might consider randomizing on the village level to ensure that your estimates are not going to be confounded because of spillovers. Okay. So I talked briefly about Bernoulli trials, but because they are like so rarely used, what I'm going to do now is going to talk a bit more about completely randomized experiments. Okay, so this is the simplest randomization approach for fixed treatment proportions. Okay, and it's also the most common approach in experimental economics. So what this means is that I know I have a certain sample size, and I know that I'm going to have 1/3 in treatment A, 1/3 in treatment B, and 1/3 in treatment in the control group. Okay. So let's assume we have only two groups, a control group and a treatment group for easiness. So we have a completely randomized experiment of n units, that is our sample size, and t are going to be assigned to the treatment, so di is equal to 1. And then NC is simply the remaining ones which are going to be assigned to the control condition. The treatment proportion pi, so that's simply the number of people in the treatment group over the entire sample, constitutes the target fraction of overall units that are to be assigned to the treatment. Okay, so this defines as like 50%, 30%, 40%, whatever. To rule out any uninteresting scenarios, what we assume is that pi is in the interval of 0 and 1, so that the probability of assignment to treatment is not extreme. So, for example, you would want to avoid the case of the Bernoulli trial, where you have everybody in the control group and nobody in the treatment group, right? So as the name completely randomized experiment suggests, the randomization approach involves treating each unit symmetrically. Okay, so that means that we are going to assign it to treatment or control conditions with the same probability as all other still unassigned units. Okay, so for example, what could we do in practice? We could be sorting our list of names of the sample in a random order. Okay, so that's something super easy to do in Excel. And then we assign the first half of the list to the treatment condition, and the second half of the list is going to be the control group. Okay. We can then take the simple difference of means, and we will get an unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect. Okay. So now, while the randomized treatment assignment in a completely randomized experiment balances out potential outcomes, okay, so we have an unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect, all other characteristics on average, and on all other characters on average, these may not be balanced in any particular randomization, okay? So what does that mean? That means that whenever we are using a completely randomized experiment approach, where we just, like randomly order a list of people and admit half of them to the treatment group, we do have to take into account that there is a chance of imbalance on covariates that are likely predictive of potential outcomes of interest, okay? So what does this mean in practice? So in practice, the situation means that outcome differences between treatment and control groups in the sample are driven by differences in baseline covariates rather than treatment assignment, okay? So, for example, what we could imagine is that by chance, the treatment group is only composed of women, whereas the control group is only composed of men, then we cannot be entirely sure that any differences in outcomes that we observe are actually driven by our treatment, or that they are not driven by the fact that, women behave differently in the outcome that we're looking at. So in this case, what happened is that our ex ante our randomization was unbiased. But ex post, it might be biased conditional on the actual treatment assignment, okay? So this raises two important questions. So knowing that imbalances might happen in a completely biased experiment, what should the researcher do in the design phase? And if we have already conducted our randomized experiment and then afterwards we find meaningful imbalances on covariates, what should we do, okay? Okay. So Ivan has a question. Oh, sorry, two questions actually. Okay. So the first one is, in the case in which we have a non-random selection criteria at the group level, example given communities, but randomization within groups, household, how do we interpret this randomization? What are the pros and cons? Any limits on interpretation bias power? Okay. So that's kind of, that's a very interesting question. So if I understand it correctly, then in the first level, you choose communities, but then you randomize within groups, okay? So here, this is an important distinction. So what happens here is that what you did is actually trying to ensure in how far your experimental design results are going to be externally valid for other contexts. If you have a non-random selection criteria at the group level, so if you non-randomly select communities, but you randomize within the group, so your households, then you will still have internal validity, okay? That means your experimental design or like your experimental results are still going to be valid and unbiased on the household level, but you will not be able to say anything about in what way your results also are going to hold up for other communities, okay? So in the way you would do this, depending on your funding restrictions and the logistics that you face, what you would want to do to ensure both external and internal validity is to actually randomly select your communities. So that's random sampling, so that you can ensure that they are actually more comparable to other communities outside. And then you would still want to randomize within the communities, your different households, for internal validity of your results. I hope this answers your question. And then distribution of the randomization, so no normal effect the estimator. I think, okay, so that's, it's kind of it's kind of a weird question, because we think about randomization rather in terms of saying you choose, like you have to have a rule of like how many people are going to be in a treatment group and how many people are not. And we're going to talk a bit about block designs in a second that is going to help you think about this clearer. But I think there's not actually a distribution of the randomization in terms of how I would think about this. But I'm happy to talk more about this later if that's helpful. Okay. So we're now going to depart from our completely randomized design, okay, to kind of get at these two important questions of what we should do. Our first point of departure is a particular restriction on the form of the assignment mechanism. So that's going to be a randomized, or also called block or stratified, a randomized block or stratified experiment. Sorry. So suppose that the full set of pretreatment covariates, xi, is discrete and can be appropriately discretized. Okay, so what does that mean? So we have our sample and we have a bunch of pretreatment covariates, which is going to be something like gender, your baseline income, your baseline education, the village that you live in, for example. And we call this in the literature of design and analysis of randomized experiments a stratum or block of experimental units. Okay. What we can do is have coarser definitions of strata. Okay, and those might be required if they are less than, not at least 2 units in a given stratum. Okay, so for example, we don't have at least 2 schools in a village, so we have to move up to the district level. Okay, but it might also be that you're interested in something more granular, and then you could say, oh, I'm interested in gender within a village, and I'm going to be making blocks of specific village female and specific village male, and then I'm going to be randomizing on those stratas. Okay. What we do when we do randomized block experiments is to simply take our CRE logic to each stratum. Okay. So what we're going to do is, first we're going to map units to the respective stratum, and then we are going to do a complete randomization within each stratum. Okay. So what does that mean? So of the total units in each stratum, NTS are assigned to the treatment condition, and the other ones are in the control group. Okay. So, for example, within a village, we're going to assign 50% of households to the treatment condition and 50% to the control condition. Or if we have a stratum with 2 types of covariates, so that we would say in each village, we take all the women first, half of the women in per village are going to be assigned to the treatment and half of them to the control group, and the same with men, and so forth. So you could do this depending on your sample size with a ton of covariates if you want to. So the proportion pi s is then the target fraction of stratum-specific units that are to be assigned to treatment. Okay. So let's talk a bit about balance. So important for the randomization to have worked, what we need is that our attributes are balanced across treated and control units. So this means that treatment and control groups cannot be statistically significantly different from each other on average. So what we can do is to check whether this is actually true by using baseline or pre-treatment data. What we, as I have said before, this might not necessarily always work out, but what we can do is to make sure that experimental groups are balanced on some covariates that we actually care about through stratification. Okay, so as I said, we partition units into blocks, and we have to make sure that assignment is independent across blocks, which is especially important with small sample frame. Okay, so like, what are the covariates that you should actually choose on? So you should stratify on the attributes that you reasonably expect to drive differences in outcomes. Okay, so if you think that gender is going to be important for your outcome, then it makes sense to think about stratifying based on gender. Okay, and then you might also stratify on the attributes you are particularly interested in. Okay, so Francisco is asking how challenging it is to run a stratified randomization in practice. So that highly depends on your specific context, and it's highly going to depend on your sample size. Okay, so if you have a large sample and you are in full control of implementation of the treatment, right? Like, that's something else which might not necessarily be the case. Then stratifying is not is not very challenging because you can, because all you do is to ensure that within a specific village, for example, the same amount of people as in the treatment group and in the control group. But if you have a very small sample and as I said, you're interested in like various strata, okay, then it might be complicated to have, for example, within the village, all the women that are of age 20 to 25, because what you need is to have at least 2 people in that group, right? Because if you only have 1, then you're not going to be able to effectively randomize. So that's the big challenge that you're going to have. Okay. Alexander is asking Jared about the David McKenzie paper. I can put it there afterwards. All right. Okay. So now what do you do if you randomize and balance fails? Okay. So that means you have randomized and then you check pre-treatment balance. And you figure out that out of your 10 covariates, 8 are actually not balanced, and the treatment group is statistically different from the control group in those aspects. Okay. We can talk about re-randomization. Okay, so we follow Lee and Ding 2020. And re-randomization mechanism is a function of assignments D and covariate X that defines what an admissible randomization is ex ante. So that typically means in terms of some measure of covariate imbalance. So you decide, okay, I'm okay if 2 of my covariates are imbalanced, but I'm not okay if it's 5. So Brunel McKenzie 2009 have a compelling account of researchers conducting re-randomization in a talk manner. Okay, what they do is to say, conducting a completely randomized experiment, assignment mechanism, checking for covariate balance. So this is what you typically see in the papers in the balance table. We conduct an eyeball test to say like, oh, this is more or less okay or not. And then we decide to whether or not we throw out the initial assignment and try again. This raises at least 2 issues, okay? So because we don't know the implicit re-randomization mechanism, we also don't know how many admissible randomizations there were in the first place, okay? So it's kind of like cherry picking which of the 2 you're gonna accept and which not. So in principle, how a researcher conducts statistical inference on their estimated average treatment effect should account for the assignment mechanism, which is a task that is often overlooked and essentially impossible when the assignment mechanism is left unspecified. Okay, so one way is to specifying this ex ante, which is something that you can pre-register in on the AEA social science registry, for example. Okay. Okay, so Alexander is asking, what about balance? Using outcomes and reallocate based on these outcomes, sort of share it. Right. So here's the thing, right? Like, I mean, if Amazon does that, is that valid or not? So in order to say you actually are sure that what you are doing is correct, then what you should do is like pre-specify and pre-register to be on the safe side and to work within within your formally defined function of assignments. Okay, so like that's the important part, and I think that's something that we have seen a lot before, and which is like why it's so overlooked to say like, oh yeah, I just have a feeling of what feels right. So yeah. Okay. Then quickly before we take a break, we're going to talk about how to actually randomize in practice. Okay. So you could do a lottery, okay, which can be a private or a public draw of program in front of the experimental subjects. Why would you, for example, do this? So this helps when there's high demand for participation. Okay, so typically you have a recruitment or sampling phase, and then there will be a lot of people that want to participate. And it's useful when there's no a priori reason for discrimination. So sometimes your research partner is going to say like, oh no, but I want to have a specific type of people in the sample, and then you can do a public draw. It's fair and transparent because participants know who's going to be winners and losers, but the potential problem is that you might have treatment effects or treatment assignment effects on your control group, which might not be willing to cooperate, and similarly, the behavior of winners might actually change. But some other contexts might require private draws or lotteries. So, for example, if there are interventions related to intimate partner violence, as you know, like the women participating, for example, might not want to actually have their partners know that they are participating in the program. Okay, so both versions require mechanisms to ensure the correct implementation of randomization. So, for example, if you randomize individually, then your randomizers, which might be your enumerators or research partners, might feel pressured to tamper with randomization to comply with participants' needs or wishes. So what we did in a research project in Uganda, for example, was to use secret tokens to help the enumerators to maintain independence, but that requires additional steps of informing participants about their group afterwards. Computer-based is, I think, something that is what most people do. So it's implemented by the researchers in Excel or Stata. You can verify balance across experimental groups immediately, but then again, you have to have a mechanism specified if you do not achieve balance through your randomization strategy, as we talked about before, because re-randomization can be problematic. Okay. In reality, you might be relatively constrained in your randomization strategy because you have limited resources of implementation partners. So it's not tomorrow, it's actually later, but Karen is going to be talking about more about like how to work with research partners. There might be contamination due to spillovers or general equilibrium effects that you have to take into account. Logistics and sample size, and then simply fairness and politics might drive what you do in terms of randomization. So I'm sorry that I'm speeding through this, but I'm running a bit late. So there are alternative randomization strategies that are randomization in the bubble, phase-in designs, or encouragement designs, okay? So in the bubble, what you do is to actually randomize among people that are borderline eligible, which has then implications for your treatment effect, external validity, okay? Phase-in means that you would want to start with one group, and then over time, the control group is going to receive the treatment as well. An encouragement design is where you don't actually randomize the treatment assignment in itself, but you randomize whether or not people are encouraged to sign up for a program. Okay. Sorry for speeding through this. There's one more question that I'm going to take. If you have others, feel free. Other than that, if you have questions or comments, you can always just email me as well. Okay, so Ivan was asking, can we and should we do re-randomization on a large database in which there was some participation bias? So re-randomization is not necessarily whether or not it's problematic is not necessarily dependent on your sample size, okay? But it's rather complicated simply because what you want is to have a clear assignment mechanism that is transparent. And this is going to be depending on whether or not you have actually pre-specified and thought about your process. But in general, re-randomizing even on a large database until you're satisfied and until you feel it's good is complicated because you could always argue, oh, so I re-randomize until, the treatment effects are what I actually want to look at, what I want them to look like. And that's difficult. Okay. And Jared is answering Alexander's question. Awesome. So then let me check something. So we were supposed to have a 15-minute break that should start 15 minutes ago. But I think my original data collection section is going to be a bit faster. So what we can do is take a 10-minute break now, and then we come back at 20 past whatever your time zone are in. Okay? Awesome. See you all in a bit. Thanks. And if you have more questions, just put them in the Q&A and we will try to respond to them in writing. Qualitative data might be something really important for you, both prior to your experimental design, but also as additional data points. Okay, so let's talk a bit about survey data. So when we only have few outcomes and we're not really able to elicit mechanism for design choices, then survey data can be extremely helpful to provide additional insights or actually give us some proper main outcomes where we don't have administrative data. Okay, so especially in less developed countries, it's often the case that our questions of interest are not going to be answerable with administrative data. But unfortunately, collecting survey data is challenging in at least 6 points that I could think of. So first of all, it's very costly because we have to pay enumerators, we have to pay their transport, sometimes we have to pay survey incentives that might be very expensive. They are time intense and it's difficult sometimes to actually schedule it correctly. We do need to have the right enumerated team, the right questionnaire, and we have to be especially concerned about attrition and non-response bias, okay? Because especially in surveys, when we try to go to houses to collect household data, people might not show up or refuse to talk to us. Okay, so about being costly and time intense, there's not much we can do other than have research grants and have the time that we need, but something that we can influence as researchers is the right enumerated team. So those are two pictures from projects of mine. The first one was in Mozambique. This is our team of enumerators in a market there conducting interviews. And as you can see, they have like batches, they have tons of papers to actually find people. And they are like calling respondents to figure out where they are. This other picture is from work that we did with JiLAEE in Argentina. And you can see they were like really excited to walk around with those caps because it was actually really hot. Okay, so what do I have as practical tips for you on how to compose your enumerated team? So first of all, you need enumerators that are familiar with the context, okay? So they help you adapt the questionnaires to the local settings, because even if you're fluent in the language that you write the questionnaire in, which might not necessarily be the case, there are always local differences that you need to take into account. If your enumerators are familiar with the context, that also reduces logistics costs, especially when they have to travel a lot and figure out where to go. And having local like enumerators familiar with the context might improve your survey responses and reduce attrition, because respondents feel more connected to enumerators, right? Like it's always very weird to say like you're this white European researcher going to a market in Maputo, Mozambique, and trying to ask people about their life there. That's just very, very far from each other. The right enumerated team knows how to handle the hardware and software that you're working with and has a high literacy level. So typically what we do is we try to hire university students, as they have been proven to be great enumerators. But in many countries with lots of research, like Uganda and Kenya, there are actually professional enumerators that work for institutions like JPOL or IPA that you can hire and that are great to work with. Something important is that you do want enumerators to be locals, but not within the social networks of your sample, okay? So you want them to speak local languages, but you might not necessarily want them to have private connections with your respondents, because that can add a lot of social pressure for the enumerators to, for example, mess with the randomization assignment or payouts of survey incentives or games incentives if we have them. And then last but not least, something that I would like to give to all of you on your way is to say, make sure that you treat your enumerated team well. So that should be something that should be natural and kind of not even a point of discussion. But I think what happens often, and there is some research being done now, is that researchers work with limited resources and limited grants, and then it's often the enumerators that have to suffer from the cost pressure and the time pressure, which is something that we shouldn't do. Okay. So when we have survey data, we often have attrition that decreases our statistical power and is particularly challenging when non-random. So we have differential attrition by treatment studies that will affect our internal validity of experimental results. So for example, we will be able, or like we are only able to find 50% of the people in the control group again. And then we're actually going to have trouble interpreting our treatment effects appropriately. But it might also be that we don't have a differential attrition by treatment studies, but we do have differential attrition by covariates, okay? So that means we had balance in terms of age at baseline, but then for endline we do not, which means we're not going to have an impact on our internal validity, but that means we're going to have negative effects on our external validity considerations, okay? So that means we're not going to be able to say much about our treatment regarding age groups, okay? There are 4 different strategies to reduce attrition. So typically what we try to do is to collect various contact data where we have alternative phone numbers, social media accounts, phone numbers of neighbors, and we invest in location technology and data to try to track people and find them again. Appreciation gifts for respondents' time actually matter. So it's important to find an appreciation gift that is valuable to our respondents, because if they truly feel appreciated, then it's going to be more likely that they're going to talk to us again. And in that way, we reduce attrition. And we can try to collect additional data like picture books, alternative names, social network data that will help us asking about the respondents that we are looking for, especially in village settings in less developed countries. And then lastly, one strategy can also be to invest in regular contact with your sample. Okay, so just like keep them posted and try to update contact data in a regular manner to find people again. The last point is, if attrition is substantial despite all your efforts, then you have to make sure to correct for it in your empirical analysis, for example, with Lee bounds. Okay. Another problem of survey data is non-response bias. And non-response bias is kind of different from attrition in the sense that it means that a respondent can choose to answer only a subset of questions, but it might also mean that they don't participate at all. If the choice to respond to questions is non-random, then this can actually bias our experimental estimates, okay? So there's a very recent paper by Dutz et al. That find that correcting for differences in observables, as we typically try to do, does not necessarily reduce non-response bias. Also, increasing incentives to participate is something that can backfire, okay? And then differences between respondents and non-respondents, what they find in their specific data and in this paper, but was most likely, able to to externalize to other contexts is that the differences between those are due to non-observables, and this is why correcting for differences in observables doesn't really help us. Okay, so Ivan is asking, examples of appreciation gifts, how much and at what point in time during the data collection? That's a really important question and very much depends on context. So for example, in a project in Uganda where we work with ultra poor women, what we give them is a bar of soap, which is like, I mean, it's like a big bar of soap, which is something that they find very helpful for their daily lives. They're really happy because we are considerate and we create a good relationship with them. We also survey kids, and there what we did was to give them, for example, pens and school supplies because that's something that they find helpful. So it should be something that is substantial and values their time, but it shouldn't be crazy expensive, okay? Because that might create expectations of, like, depending on the context of giving them money, which you might not be able to fulfill. And I prefer not to give money, because as soon as you give money, it's kind of like putting a value on your time. Okay, and that might be complicated as well. At what point in time during the data collection? Typically, we give it at the end of the survey to as a thank you for their time. Okay. All right. So if you have non-response bias, I think this paper is really helpful, because what they do is to develop a new extrapolation framework where you can distinguish between active and passive non-participants, okay? And then you can produce bounds that are actually better fits than what is currently existing in the literature as alternatives. So if you use survey data and you have a lot of non-responses and you think there might be a non-response bias, then I would advise you to check out this paper to see whether you have a bias and how you can potentially correct for it. Okay. A different class of data comes from behavioral games. Okay, so this is something that we use if we suspect that survey data is misleading, especially if the experimental design provides incentives for motivational lying. So if there might be experimental demand effects, or if our survey data might suffer from substantial measurement error. Okay, so measurement error, for example, would be something I'm asking you about. You're an entrepreneur and I'm asking you about your sales in the last month, and this is something very difficult for you to actually have data on because you don't know. Then this is going to affect your statistical power. And obviously motivational lying can indicate treatment effects where there are none. So conducting behavioral games in the field, so conducting frame field experiments or lab in the fields, as they are also called, can help you to provide additional evidence where you can complement or substitute your survey measures, and then you can use that to either validate your survey measure or provide additional outcome measures. You have to think about two types of particular challenges when you want to do this. The first one is choose incentives that are appropriate to context and figure out a way to pay your subjects without having to have your enumerators or the people that do the games walk around with money, because generally that's dangerous, and in a lot of places the challenge is that participants are unbanked, so you cannot make a transfer. So you have to figure out a way to get this. Francisco is asking how to deal with incentivized games and like what would be an appropriate type of incentives, for example, for high school students. So this very much depends on your context, and it's also going to, and I'm going to say this in a good way, it's going to depend on your IRB, okay? So whatever you do, whenever you run a field experiment and collect data, you should always get IRB approval, and the IRB is also going to check whether your incentives are going to be appropriate for the context. In general, I think among high school students, and that depends on their age. It's unusual to give them money as incentives. I think what I have seen before is like for young kids to give them, for example, candies. Karen has worked with high school students as well and can maybe talk about this later. But for example, as incentives, you would give them not money, but you would give them small vouchers, and with that they can go to your like researcher shop and buy themselves high school supplies, for example. So in that way, you have to think about the appropriate context, and then I would always make sure to compare this with the existing literature. But I think especially with minors, giving them money is in general complicated. Okay, another challenge to consider when you conduct those games is participants' literacy level. So for example, if you work with high school students, or if you work with participants that have a low literacy level, then you have to make sure that the instructions are going to be adapted. And in a lot of cases, you will want to illustrate the choice set. So you will not only ask the question theoretically, but have some kind of illustration for that. Okay. Then an important part about incentives is that they can affect participation and correct biases when properly designed. But as we have seen before, they might also have unanticipated consequences or not actually be adequate to elicit behavior changes. I have to be quick, so what I want you to look at is 3 different types of biases and problems that might occur when you design games or work with incentives in general. The first one is hypothetical bias, which occurs when the outcome behavior of a subject in an experiment is different from their behavior in real life. Okay, so this is because you have highly incentivized participation or certain behaviors, and then you can actually not say anything about this behavior in the real world. There's the stakes effect problem, where we refer to changes in behavior due to changes in the size of the payoff expected from the outcome of a game or a gamble. So you have to be really careful about the stakes that you select. And there's a flat payoff problem as well that refers to payoff functions that plateau for a wide range of inputs and subsequently fail to incentivize participants to reach the theoretical optimum. So all of what this says is incentives can be super helpful, but when you work with incentives, it's extremely difficult to get them right, so you have to be very careful. Okay, and then the last point I want to talk about is qualitative data and how qualitative data can be helpful for us when we collect, when we do field experiments. So the first one is ex ante, where we should do focus groups and pilot studies that actually inform our experimental design, okay? So that means we talk to people about the treatment interventions which will help us improve their design, but we can also test and do focus groups about our questionnaire, especially in settings with low literacy, and to ensure context appropriateness. The questionnaire testing also helps us to generate new hypotheses and questions that might actually be more important for our research. And then, especially when we talk about behavioral economics, we often talk about psychometric outcomes that are difficult to quantify, okay? And then we can use qualitative data to complement our main data collection efforts to answer additional questions. So for example, we can ask, we can conduct in-depth survey interviews to talk about mechanisms that are driving effects of programs and policies, or how the context design and implementation of the program influences the results, which is going to help us to scale up in the future. Or we can say, if it would be replicated in a different context, do you think the program will have the same effects? And then ultimately, we can try to figure out if we actually ask the right questions, okay? So all these qualitative methods are extremely helpful, not only in designing our experiment, but also like when we actually write up the paper to understand what's going on. Okay. And then about some practical tips about qualitative data. while designing your field experiment, don't discount questions that can best be addressed with qualitative methods. Like, it's becoming more and more appropriate and okay to do qualitative data methods in economics papers. If you want to do that, don't forget to account for it in your study proposals and budget, because they can be quite time and cost intense. And then what you should do is, whenever you have an implementing partner, cultivate your relationships with them and diversify your research team so that you speak to your implementing partner in detail and can figure out what they are doing. And optimally, you would want to have somebody on your research team that actually knows how to do qualitative data collection, because that's important. Okay, I'm going to take one more minute to respond to the last question by Ivan. To provide a bit more detailed examples about the triangulation between survey data and experiments. Why, when, and how. Okay, so survey data, I would say most importantly, nowadays you need it when there is no administrative data available that is going to let you talk about, well, first of all, main outcomes, of course, but also about mechanisms, which become more and more important. So I think we're going to talk about this more during the conference in various panels, but something important nowadays for really good publications in experimental economics is that you not only do an impact evaluation of a program, but that you're actually able to explain why that impact actually occurs. And a lot of times, administrative data will just not be informative enough to get there. Now, about the when and how, that's difficult to answer, right? Because the when is typically, so that's something that Jared talked about briefly. Typically, we say the more data points we have, the better. So a baseline can be helpful. Obviously, you want to have an end line. And then if you want to have like midline follow-ups that provide you with more data points, this can be really helpful as well. How wildly depends on your context. So sometimes an online experiment will be, with online survey data, will be successful because people actually respond. A lot of times that's not the case, and you need to do at least a phone survey. And if you work in context in less developed countries that are very isolated, then most likely you have to go there and do in-person surveys. And then typically what we do is, nowadays we use tablets, which are less error-prone than pen and paper. And we have enumerated teams go and ask questions. I hope this was helpful.